I'm Denise Allen, curator at the Frick Collection, and it gives me the greatest pleasure to introduce Emerson Bowyer to you. Emerson has completed his 2-year Andrew W. Mellon Fellowship at the Frick. He did that in August. And you see him tonight in his role as guest curator of the David Danger exhibition, which is now on view in the galleries downstairs. Now, normally Mellon Fellows do not stay on after their term is completed. But his co-supervisors, Susan Galassi, senior curator, and I have had such fun with Emerson and learned so much from him that we just had to keep him on as long as we could. And our sentiments are shared by many here, even though sometimes I have to say that Emerson has provided us all with a very wild ride. But now I'll be serious. Emerson's dissertation at Columbia University, which he will defend this fall, is entitled Numismatic Modernity. And in that work, the sculptor and writer David Danger figures large. Mellon Fellows are asked to create an exhibition during their time at the Frick. In David Danger, Making the Modern Monument, Emerson has effectuated something that is extraordinarily difficult. He has transformed the ideas and arguments intrinsic to his dissertation into an exhibition. Now, translation of a scholarly text into a visual exhibition is normally considered a very, very bad idea, if not impossible. Yet Emerson has achieved this, and anyone going downstairs into the galleries will be struck not only by the vigorous beauty of the objects presented there, but also by the intellectual energy that is integral to David Danger's art. In those small spaces, surrounded by 47 works of art, which include medallions, statuettes, terracottas, waxes, books, decorative objects, busts in marble and plaster, and drawings, in fact, the widest variety of media ever shown together at the Frick. One feels downstairs the exhilaration of being in the presence of a wide-ranging, restless, artistic mind at work. And one senses not only the power of David's intellect, but also his always thoughtful and sometimes tender humanity. Spend time with the exhibition, and you will come away with something essential regarding David's art. And what you bring home with you, you will always remember. Emerson has conjured a certain magic in those galleries. It is a stunning and rare accomplishment. At the Frick, we are all grateful to have participated with him on this project. It has been a stimulating thing just to watch Emerson work. Emerson's sensitive choice of objects, his collaboration with the Frick's brilliant exhibition designer, Stephen Saiatis, and the beautiful lighting of Anita Jorgensen have created a jewel-like display. And jewel-like intimacy is not a feeling normally associated with David's art. Yet at the Frick, this feeling of intimacy draws us into the essence of David's definition of a monument. To David, a monument was large, not by virtue of its physical size, but because its relation to history and its contribution to posterity were profound and encompassing. Emerson's extraordinary exhibition was fashioned to teach us that. And the elegant catalogue, realized under the direction of the Frick editor, Michael and Mitchell, both complements and preserves the unforgettable experience downstairs. And I'll show you the elegant catalog, which is available. It is a wonderful read. At the Frick, we are grateful to Colin Bailey, and especially to Ian Wardroper, who tirelessly supported this exhibition. And it is here today because of his enthusiastic, steadfast belief in it and his direction of it. We are also grateful to the donors whose support made the exhibition possible. And lastly, we are especially grateful to the lenders, many experts of David Danger's art themselves, who helped guide Emerson as he made his choices and who have so generously lent their works and supported this show. Now with that, I would like you to welcome Emerson Bowyer, who will discuss Sculpting History, David Donget and the Romantic Monument. Please join me in welcoming Emerson.
Before I start, I want to give a big thank you to the staff at the Frick for making all of this possible for me and for giving me the greatest 2 years of my life, I think, especially Ian Wardropper and Colin Bailey and Susan Galassi, and especially Denise Allen, who has been my mentor the last 2 years, and it was so lovely to just now hear her kind words. And also, from me, a big thanks to the lenders as well, whose enthusiasm and works, without which this exhibition wouldn't have been possible. Now, fortuitously, the Frick's current exhibition has opened at the conclusion of an important contemporary New York art project, Thomas Hirshhorn's Monument to Gramsci. Erected in the Bronx at the beginning of the summer, Hirshhorn's monument was a sprawling, complex, and exciting intervention in the monumental genre. It compelled visitors to consider many timely questions. What is a monument, and what is its relevance today? How does it engage with problems of duration, materiality, community, and both political and social practice? What information does a monument convey, and by what means? Who is addressed by a monument? These questions were also of fundamental importance to David Donget, the subject of the Frick's exhibition. Lauded by Victor Hugo as the Michelangelo of Paris, David was one of the most important sculptors of the 19th century. An ardent Republican and political dissident, experimental writer, and confidant to innumerable artists and intellectuals, he was both celebrated and controversial during his lifetime. Although today he is little known, David produced some of the most iconic portraits and ambitious public monuments of the Romantic era. Taken in its entirety, David's career presents a profound investigation of the function and significance of memory and the representation of the past. In an epoch marked by both intense historicism and the ever-accelerating rhythms of modernity, David sought to redefine the very notion of a monument. Born in 1788, on the eve of the French Revolution, David spent his early years assisting in his father's ornamental woodcarving workshop in Angers, a city located some 200 miles southwest of Paris. In 1808, he traveled to Paris and enrolled in the École des Beaux-Arts as a student of the sculptor Philippe Laurent Roland. There he attracted the attention of Jacques-Louis David, who invited the impoverished student to study in his studio free of charge. In early 1811, he won the École's annual Tête d'Expression, or Expressive Head competition, with an extraordinary bust representing pain. La Douleur is a thrillingly tense conjunction of timeless classicism and the material immediacy of the real. The work demonstrates David's deep familiarity with classical precedents, such as the Laocoon, while retaining a strong sense of the posed, fashionably side-whiskered model from which he worked. Rather than relying on superficial and schematic facial movement for its effect, La Douleur evokes a unified bodily organism, one that seems to extend beyond the limits imposed by the bust format. Head, neck, and shoulders act in concert, each contributing meaningfully to the representation of pain. David's anatomical precision reflects his investigation of dissected corpses with the young Parisian medical professor Pierre-Augustin Béclard. Around this time, and probably in consultation with Béclard, the sculptor executed a series of large and highly finished anatomical drawings. One sheet, which you see here, vividly pictures what could almost be the meaty, subcutaneous machinery of La Douleur, a straining web of veins and muscles that, in the plaster, seems veiled only by the finest of membranes. Here, David provides an innovative interpretation of Toussaint Bernard Émeric David's publication, Research on the Art of Sculpture. Each time you study a dissected part of the human body, writes Émeric David, model or draw the corresponding part of a live model. During this work, keep the antique constantly before you so it might serve to mediate between dissected and living nature. Unlike other contemporary attempts to harmonize antiquity and modern physiology, for example, Jean-Galbert Salvage's overly literal illustrations of the Apollo Belvedere, Ladouleur is a hybrid figure that exploits the ambiguous space between classical idealism and the fleshy, pulsing reality of the living body. As such, it teeters on the brink of romanticism. In September 1811, David took first place in the Prix de Rome competition, which enabled him to spend the next 4 years studying in Italy. There he frequented the studio of the great Italian sculptor Antonio Canova, whose cool neoclassicism he admired but made little attempt to emulate. It was probably in Canova's studio, filled to capacity with plasters of the master's sculptures, that David first imagined a museum of his own work. In 1839, the Galerie David d'Angers would officially open within the Museum of Fine Arts in his native city of Angers, the first permanent institutional exhibition space devoted to the work of a living artist. Throughout his career, the gallery received a regular flow of objects from the sculptor, and by the late 1850s would house an almost complete collection of his sculpture. Returning to Paris in 1816, David received his first major commission from the Restoration government. With the death of Roland earlier that same year, he inherited his teacher's unexecuted contract for a colossal sculpture of Louis de Bourbon, the 17th century French general known as the Grand Condé. This was an exceptional show of faith in a young and untested artist. David's half-size plaster model for the statue made its debut at the Salon of 1817, although the 13-foot marble, now unfortunately destroyed, would not be completed for another decade. The Grand Condé breaks with the neoclassical style that had dominated sculptural production for almost half a century, and whose major proponents were Antonio Canova and Bertel Thorvaldsen. David rejects the cool repose of neoclassical sculpture in favor of dramatic action. In its conception and effect, the work owes more to innovations in painting than sculpture. For example, you see here Antoine Jean Gros' Bonaparte on the bridge at Arcueil. A significant departure from his teacher Roland's more stilted earlier representation of the same subject matter, David's Condé is a confluence of oppositional forces. His extravagantly costumed figure rears back while preserving forward momentum, and all the while he whirls like a turbine. The statue depicts a crucial episode from the life of the Condé, when the young officer hurled his general's baton at the enemy before leading his troops forward to reclaim it. David presents the instant immediately preceding the baton's release, when the Condé coils like a spring. And yet, precisely with that bodily stance, he allows us to imagine an almost cinematic unfolding of the action on a wider temporal continuum, both before and after the event pictured. This is animated history, and one contemporary viewer even likened it to a hurricane. And here you can see an early preliminary drawing for the sculpture, where you can see the absolute dynamism that David was intending to invest in the sculpture. The sculpture itself seems to have lost a little bit of that dynamism, probably due to the demands of gravity. But the drawing is a very beautiful and important record of just the sort of feverish energy he was trying to achieve. The statue also raised the hotly contested issue of costume. For viewers used to heroic nudity or sinuous and transparent sheets of classical drapery, David's historically garbed figure was a jarring sight. Such vestments threatened to anchor illustrious men too firmly within a particular historical period and social milieu, weakening their universal qualities and appeal. On the other hand, clothing famous French men in classical drapery or giving them heroic nude bodies, especially those depicted at a more advanced age, could produce farcical results, a problem Jacques-Louis David had encountered in the 1790s when composing his tennis court oath. Throughout his career, David d'Angers alternated between heroic nudity and historical costume, adapting his approach to the specific circumstances of each subject and commission. A child of the French Revolution, David d'Angers inherited a world whose traditional experience of time had been irreparably shattered. Before the events of 1789 and their chaotic aftermath, history was primarily understood as cyclical and therefore repeatable, as metaphorically synchronous with the stars and seasons. Revolution meant only the turning back on itself of a thing. Consider, for example, Claude Michel Clodion's Dance of Time, which I'm sure you're all very familiar with from the Frick itself, which belongs to that earlier epoch. There, three linked nymphs endlessly and unconcernedly circle and support a timepiece turning within a transparent globe. Any sense of the horizontal progression of time or of its fits and starts is tempered and contained by the centripetal force of the ensemble. This comforting conception of history as a closed loop, so elegantly conveyed by Clodion's clock, enabled the identification of exemplary events and their investiture with instructional value. Accordingly, it was the foundation for the exalted genres of history painting and sculpted monuments. The Revolution, by contrast, appeared to be an unprecedented, unique occurrence, its singularity sliced through the loop of cyclical history, which thenceforth seemed to stretch out into an unknowable future. The 1790s brought a frenzy of destruction, erasing the material presence of the monarchic past and effectively unmooring the present. There was, of course, a flurry of designs for monuments commemorating the recent revolutionary past, stable in ancient forms like obelisks, pyramids, colossal statuary, and grand neoclassical architecture. But few of these projects were executed, and those that were tended to be constructed of inexpensive and impermanent materials. History, it seemed, could no longer be crystallized into a coherent, finished, and durable form. The shape and boundaries of events were no longer legible, nor were the lessons to be drawn from them. Mobility and contingency increasingly defined everyday experience. For Thomas Carlyle, this was the age of paper. Paper money, reams of political pamphlets and coarse prints, the rise of the newspaper, all these ephemeral rags stuck precariously to signboards, crumpled and carried and thrown away. In 1836, Alfred de Musset articulated the dire consequences of these developments. The whole sickness of our present century, he wrote, derives from two causes. Everything that has been is no more, and everything that will be is not yet. Within a year or two of Musset's diagnosis, David expressed his desire to create a representation of time. It would be, he wrote, a great and terrible old man, his face veiled by drapery and with clouds further contributing to his mysteriousness. He will hold a scythe and lean on an Egyptian lyre. He will stand on a boulder, on the right and at his feet, a cradle from which the generations will spring, and who will attempt to touch the lyre, only to be swallowed by the gaping tomb to the left of the central figure. Thankfully, in a corresponding sketch, the sculptor provides a more complex, redemptive version of the allegory. Here, time no longer plays the callous or indifferent traffic director of our brief passage between life and death, although a trace of that conception remains in the proximity of the children's heads to the well-worn blade of the scythe. Instead, he seems to shelter humanity on the rocky outcrop of the present. Beneath his outstretched hand is a curious assemblage of artifacts: a Gothic cathedral, a helmet and shield, the latter bearing the word Roma, and a Roman trophy. And in discussions with Jacques de Casso, who has contributed to the catalogue recently, he discovered that the cathedral in the background is actually the cathedral in Angers. So there's also, beyond the sort of history of Rome in a very, very ancient past in a different place, there also is a very localized history for David in this image of time. For him, monuments had the potential to reconcile the disconnect between past and future and to firmly anchor the present. Sculptors, he repeatedly asserted, should be historians and archivists, and their works documents whose testimony is offered up to the future. Here you see, pictured ensconced at the feet of time, both a writer and an artist who are being directed toward the monuments by David, so that they can serve as the mediators between the past and the present. Sculptors, David repeatedly asserted, should be historians and archivists. His understanding of monumentality was influenced by the contemporaneous rise of archaeology, geology, and paleontology. Discoveries at Pompeii and other ancient sites had exposed the inevitable mortality of civilizations, and the scientific studies of Georges-Louis Leclerc-Buffon and Georges Cuvier had challenged the biblical age of the earth. Cuvier, in particular, fascinated the artist, who produced no less than 2 statues, a portrait bust, and a medal commemorating the scientist. In one of those statues, Cuvier stands like a titan, one finger digging down into a cracked globe in search of origins. His body becomes, quite literally, a medium for the earth's shuddering voice that passes into his upraised hand, its rhetorical gesture communicating so many subterranean secrets. According to Cuvier, the natural world had been subject to its own successive revolutions and various catastrophes. Fossils, he argued, were the disparate material documents of such events, and those who studied them, a new species of antiquarian. As imprints or traces of long-expired organisms, fossils simultaneously embodied survival and loss. Synthesizing Cuvier's theories with his own artistic philosophy, David wrote that after the world has experienced one of those revolutions that alter its physiognomy, paintings will have disappeared, but zoology will perhaps conserve the statue of one of those immortal men who have appeared for the glory of mankind. David often imagined Paris in the distant future, not as a thriving metropolis, but as a ruin, its rubble imprinted like the petrified remains of primordial plants and animals. Anticipating this future, many of his colossal portrait busts exaggerate their rounded terminations. This does not simply reference antiquity. Rather, it insists on the fragmented and archaeological status of the busts, as if they are already ruins. And this head of the colossal statue of Constantine, the head would have been visible to David when he was studying in Rome. And you can see how he's very interested in copying, in a sense, or making us very aware of the breaks or joins in these antique statues, which indicate that they are only parts of a lost whole. The sculptor also extracted small elements from his finished works, effectively producing willful fragments. For example, the casts of a single head from his Pantheon relief that were distributed to his friends. And here you see the figure of Napoleon on the far right from his Pantheon pediment in Paris, that we'll see a little later. And in the middle is a plaster model that was used to make smaller fragments of that larger pediment to be sent to very close friends. And I'm very pleased to show the image in the center, as it's a new acquisition by the Met, so I encourage you all to go there and see what is quite a remarkable work. Something similar occurs in David's striking study after a plaster cast of the Apollo Belvedere, where the head of the canonical sculpture lies across the page like a decapitated fragment or death mask. Appropriately, this ossified imprint of an antique monument bears a dedicatory inscription to Cuvier himself. Beginning in the mid-18th century, the category of the public monument, those works of art erected in a public place to conserve and convey to posterity the memory of illustrious persons or remarkable events, experienced profound change, especially in France. With the rise of secular individualism and the waning of royal power and prestige, monuments began to be erected to individual private citizens, grand hommes who had distinguished themselves in battle, politics, the arts, or the sciences. The democratic ideals of the Revolution, as well as the Napoleonic culture of merit, accelerated the development of this age of pantheons. Eulogies, collective biographies, dictionaries of celebrated contemporaries, series of portrait prints, and even waxwork museums. All these probe the category of the great man, rushing to fill its borders with a litany of exemplary names. Throughout his career, David would enthusiastically, even obsessively, seek commissions for monuments to historical figures whom he admired, while refusing to produce statues for those he considered unworthy. "I have the utmost fanaticism for all those who have done great things," he wrote in 1830, "even for men whose opinions differ from mine. I've always tried to pay them the tribute of my admiration with the means provided by my art." As David A. Bell has written, illustrious figures were increasingly identified according to the needs of emerging nationalist discourses. They were understood as having rendered their services first and foremost to the national community and helped consciously to build that community by their efforts and examples. For most Europeans in the early 19th century, however, the past had become personal and partisan as regimes rose and fell in quick succession. The tumultuous history of Paris's Pantheon during this period reveals the slippery politics of great men. Heroic figures were interred there, only to be unceremoniously evicted when the political winds changed. David's own career highlight, the sculpted pediment for that building, sparked a vicious and very public spat with the July monarchy. The challenging style of the colossal bas-relief was eclipsed by the debate raging over David's choice of historical figures to stand above the inscription on the Pantheon's facade, "To great men, the grateful nation." And you can see how this bas-relief would have disturbed the more conservative government at the end of the 1830s when it was first seen. David dared to include in his pantheon of great men figures such as Bonaparte, Rousseau, Jacques-Louis David. So he wasn't a popular man, and the government refused to even unveil the work, so it was up underneath tarpaulin for at least 6 months. And David was lucky in a sense to have a lot of friends who were well-respected writers in the press, even people such as Victor Hugo, who were writing in to argue for the dropping of this sort of meaningless or overblown debate, and to actually allow the public to finally see the work, which was still under tarpaulin. David's monuments were intended to be educational, inspirational, and community building, magnets for public gathering. They drew upon nationalism and local pride, and often became loci for civic ritual. Above all, David understood that a successful statue needed to be legible. To this end, the eloquent gesture became integral to his aesthetic philosophy. Gesture, he wrote in 1839, is the language of sculpture. The attitude, the gaze, must precede speech as lightning precedes thunder. In art, gesture is the most powerful means of expression in that it reveals a soul so profoundly full of feeling that, impatient to express itself, it chooses the most rapid signs. Consider, for example, his Ambroise Paré, which here is illustrated by a very beautiful bronze reduction produced by the famous foundry Barbedienne, and which is included in the exhibition. This was a monument to the famous French military doctor and pioneer of modern surgery. The subject posed significant challenges. How to simultaneously communicate Paré's qualities of both action and thought. David's elegant solution utilizes all the expressive potential of the body, creating a vibrant interplay between action and repose. With head bowed and the index finger of his right hand delicately raised to his chin and curling inward, Paré seems lost in profound meditation. And yet, at the same time, his hand hovers just above his surgical implements, ready to seize them should the need arise. In contrast to his muscular body and weighty, voluminous costume, Paré's fingers are elongated to produce thin, almost snake-like appendages. These are, David makes clear, the precise and subtle hands of a surgeon. One of David's most successful monuments, in which he achieves his desire for the presentation of easily and immediately accessible meaning, is his monument to Bonchamp of 1824, which commemorates a royalist general who had died in the Vendée. According to popular belief, the young officer's last words commanded his soldiers to spare the lives of their Republican prisoners. This was extremely important for David, and he copped a little bit of criticism over the course of his career for having made this sculpture to a royalist general, being such a militant Republican himself. And he explained quite often that the point was not, he wasn't being hypocritical. There was a very personal reason for producing this monument, which was that his father had been amongst the Republican prisoners that were sentenced to death, and whom the general had spared with his last words. For the sculpture, David chose to depict this moment of Bonchamp's last words, a conciliatory scene that reflected post-revolutionary attempts to reunite the fractured nation. David specifically references the figure of a river god from the recently discovered Elgin marbles, which he had studied in London. And here on the left you can see a study that he had made of that figure from the Elgin marbles. Yet I think you can see that he reconstructs and transforms that languid classical form to achieve an effect of expressive urgency and dramatic instantaneity. Like La Douleur, Bonchamp's body is an amalgam of the classical and the real. The general's mouth opens to enact the exclamatory phrase inscribed directly below his body, "Mercy to the prisoners." This relationship between written word and oral utterance recalls the talking statues David would have observed in Rome when he was there on his Rome Prize. Fragments of antique statuary, the most famous of which being the Pasquino on the right, to which written phrases were affixed by passers-by. In the monument to Bonchamp, word and sound are bound together by gesture. The dying man's struggle for uprightness against a body rapidly surrendering to gravity is captured by the straining arm pushing down on the ground, its veins bulging with the pressure, and his widened eyes, creased brow, and open mouth all support the unforgettable halting motion of the upraised hand. Here David updates traditional rhetorical gestures, such as that in Jacques-Louis David's Death of Socrates, and draws equally upon iconographies of both command and supplication. The result is a wholly modern communicative sign, and one which is almost primitive in its viscerality. For David, the depiction of the human face was the great career to which modern art is called. By the end of his life, the sculptor had modeled about 100 busts and more than 500 portrait medallions. Although he was more prolific than other artists, his interest in portraiture was hardly exceptional. The early 19th century witnessed a dramatic increase in that genre, largely in response to the rise of the middle classes and subsequent changes in the art market and systems of patronage. But unlike Ingres, for example, David never derided portraiture or claimed it was merely a means for financial enrichment. In fact, the majority of his portrait busts and all the medallions were not commissioned. According to David, the face alone could constitute a monument. His busts, for example, were often intended to serve a public purpose. Each visage was a moral exemplar and an archival document for posterity. And here you see a whole array of famous figures in busts by David in his hometown museum in Angers, in the Galerie David d'Angers. Each family, wrote David, religiously conserves the portraits of its ancestors. They are its pantheon. Thus, a nation must, with greater reason, consecrate and carefully preserve the traits of men who have devoted their existence to the happiness and glory of the nation, which is the great family. Where possible, David insisted on modeling his portraits from life, traveling as far as Germany and Britain for sittings with his subjects. And this is a detail of his passport, or a later passport, which still exists in Angers. And it's fascinating that in David's era, passports didn't have images attached, so one would have to be described via words or signalement. And you can see all his personal specs, if you like, written down the left-hand side of the passport. Eye color, size, all of these sorts of things. And I wondered what David would have thought of a document like this and its efficacy as somebody who is so deeply invested in the likeness of the human being and the human individual themselves. Here you see a remarkable painting in Dresden on the left, which depicts David in the act of modeling a colossal head of the German Romantic writer Tieck. And we're very lucky to have in the exhibition a stunning small statuette, which was also made during David's sittings with Tieck. And I think you can see the correspondence straight away between the statuette and the positioning by Vogel von Vogelstein of the art of Tieck in the painting. Dialogue, as I think you can see here as well, particularly in the statuette where Tieck gestures as he converses with David while David produces the portrait. David thought that dialogue was integral to the production of the portraits, and he valued his conversations with his sitters, often recording them in his notebooks. And so we have some wonderful recorded conversations between him and such luminaries as Goethe, Paganini, and they're well worth a read if you've never encountered David's carnet or notebooks, 2 massive volumes in print, which are easily, I think, the equal of Delacroix's journals. So for centuries, the face had been a privileged site of signification, a transparent medium through which the interior state of a subject was made visibly manifest. But if modernity was the playground of the individual, it was equally host to an array of crowds, classes, société anonyme, criminal types, and other non-individualized entities. David certainly subscribed to the conventional idea that it is on the face that the passions are translated, but his understanding of the precise relationship between one's interior and exterior was heavily influenced by contemporary medical and scientific discourses. David's portraits, especially the busts, reflect his considerable interest in the controversial practice of phrenology. Founded by Franz Joseph Gall, this so-called science presented a theory of the relationship between mind and brain. Broadly, it posited that the brain was an assemblage of organs, with each one accounting for the relative power of a corresponding mental faculty. Thus, as Jan Goldstein has shown, the mind became an ensemble of parts, even a network. An eminently sculptural theory, phrenology typically involved investigation of the surface of the skull, whose bumps supposedly echoed the various volumes of the brain organs contained within. And I think you can see in this remarkable portrait of Gall, the sort of inventor of this pseudoscience, the sculptural qualities that would have appealed so much to David. It also appeared to David's archaeological and zoological understanding of history. By the science of Dr. Gall, he wrote, if in ancient times the name of the character represented in marble was deleted, a Gaullist could now tell you this is the representation of a man of genius, purely by looking at the surface of the skull of the statue. Accordingly, David sculpted heads such as, I think, most famously, the Goethe, which you see here, a colossal plaster cast in the Musée d'Orsay. They become dramatically uneven surfaces, three-dimensional topographic maps of individual organizations, as the network of brain organs was described. Important physical traits are accentuated in order to render their existence and significance easily and supposedly universally legible. The most successful of David's busts create a tension between movement and stasis. The general symmetry and thick, elongated neck, and I'll go back to this. The general symmetry and elongated neck of the portrait of Chateaubriand, for example, evokes the stability of a column. And yet closer inspection of the face reveals slight ripples, such as the lips pulled more tightly on the right side. Framing the face is a writhing mass of hair that creeps forward onto the forehead like a vine, a materialization of agitated thought. In his portraits of both men and women, David relished the depiction of hair. But while his male subjects tend to present organic, unruly, and vital coiffures, those of his female subjects are often strikingly architectural, such as the twin ovular protuberances of Anne Buchan Robinson. Despite the purely private function of this work, probably commissioned by the sitter's husband, the austere, almost abstracted geometric forms of the hairstyle produce a cool and distant severity. The ultimate goal of David's colossal busts, a difficult one that preoccupied many Romantic artists, was the permanent visualization of genius in all its multiple and fleeting manifestations. Classical conceptions of ideal beauty have little role here, and for a number of critics, the artist had not so much improved nature as much as deformed it. Consider, for example, the Paganini, easily at the summit, I think, of Romantic portraiture. This was the age of the musical virtuoso, and when David met Paganini in 1830, the musician was already a mythic figure. David recalled that when he told the violinist of his desire to portray him with head lowered and to the side, as if he were playing his instrument, Paganini replied, "Yes, because I draw from my interior to impress upon my exterior." Here David moves beyond the programmatic dictates of phrenology. The skeletal structure of the head seems to warp and palpitate, entirely at the mercy of the internal tremors of genius, an effect only enhanced by the shifting play of light across the surface of the bronze cast. Notably, the bust does not literally depict Paganini's instrument, but it can be sensed by the slight tilt of the head, the furrowed brow, and the upward push of the right cheek. The origin of music here is not the instrument, but the transformative mind of the musician. Today, David's portrait medallions are the best known and most readily collectible of his works. Over a period of roughly 40 years, the sculptor produced a portable pantheon of some 500 contemporaries. This horde of mostly illustrious men and women was mass-produced by Parisian foundries, pirated and hawked on the streets of many European cities, and coveted by gluttonous consumers of celebrity. They provided new and eminently mobile monuments that adapted well to the demands of modern life. The works, especially the earliest examples, such as this portrait of Delacroix, are consciously positioned in dialogue with a longer tradition of medal production. Hardly a new medium in the 19th century, medals drew much of their authority and prestige from a supposed connection to numismatic conventions reaching back into antiquity. Essentially an invention of the Renaissance, they were widely considered the most reliable and educative evidence or testimony of the past. Unlike their Renaissance counterparts, David's examples are generally quite large, mostly between 10 and 18 centimeters in diameter. They are single-sided and possess considerable relief. For this reason, they're usually called medallions rather than medals, although there has always been some slippage between the terms. David is often credited with the 19th century revival of cast bronze medallic portraits, an opinion he himself seems to have held. In a notebook entry of 1835, the sculptor complained that since he had started making medallions, many other sculptors had begun to do the same. However, as early as the mid-18th century, portrait medallions were produced in terracotta and plaster, most notably by Jean-Baptiste Nini and then Joseph Chinard. And here you see an example of Chinard's portraiture, this probably from the opening years of the 19th century. But they were also made early on in porcelain by Wedgwood and Sèvres. In 1805, Lorenzo Bartolini produced a bronze portrait of Ingres, which you see on the right, which David surely saw when he was in Rome as a student. Its glyptic format bears similarities with David's early efforts in the genre. Many of David's Parisian contemporaries, including Jean-Jacques Barre, Bailly, de Verrier, Dusanier, and Préault, were also creating medallions. But none of them pursued the genre with David's zeal, nor were they so thoroughly identified with it in the public mind. His first medallions probably date from around 1815, but his production in the genre was sporadic until the late 1820s. Wax and terracotta were generally used to produce the models for the medallions, and, like the busts, they were modeled from life where possible. If those materials were unavailable, David would first make a drawing. And here you can see one of the rare examples of not just the fact that they happened, but also the fact that they still exist, of a drawing made by David with the idea of a medal in mind, and then a terracotta model for the medal, which is based off the drawing, and then a final bronze cast of the medal. Although few have survived, the models for David's medallions have a remarkable freshness and immediacy. The surfaces of the waxes, in particular, combine moments of precise, subtle modeling and explosions of deep and roughly carved furrows. They visibly bear the pressings and moldings of David's fingertips, and the slate supports often include the scratched names of himself and the sitters. With notable exceptions, David's medallions present portraits in profile, a standard medallic compositional trope that stemmed from ancient coins. Like so many others in the late 18th and 19th centuries, David valued the profile view for its ability to quickly and accurately describe a human face. The science of physiognomy, largely the invention of Lavater, which posited that the human profile offered a sign by which the interior state of a subject could be deciphered, had been a sensation across Europe and America. Although physiognomy differed from phrenology, the overriding semiotic strategies were similar. David famously wrote that, "I have always been moved by the sight of a profile. The profile is in relation to other beings. It will shun you. It doesn't see you. The full face shows you many traits and is more difficult to analyze. The profile is unity. The charming portraits of David's children, Robert and Hélène, might be seen as the exceptions that prove the rule. For their efficacy, both phrenology and physiognomy required mature subjects whose profiles and cranial structure had become relatively stable. This meant that children whose skulls had not yet completed their development did not lend themselves so readily as subjects. While Robert and Hélène are presented in profile, each medallion includes more of their body, thereby diminishing focus on the head as seat of intelligence. Instead, these works are allegories of the senses, taste and smell. Hélène sniffs at a narcissus flower, and Robert sucks on his thumb. Here, sensual immediacy, unaltered by the processes of socialization, marks the innocence of Robert and Hélène. From around 1830, David began to inscribe his sitters' signatures on the medals, instead of simply their names, as in the portrait here of Melanie Waldor. This was a strategy for bolstering the authenticity of the portraits. Each simulated signature echoes the inscription of the sitter's linear profile. During this period, there was a growing interest in handwriting and signatures, and the collection of signatures of famous men and women in albums was a popular pastime. David himself participated in this practice, often seeking out samples of handwriting and signatures belonging to those whose portraits he produced. Of course, his practice of copying, one might even say counterfeiting, his subjects' signatures immediately undermined the claim of authenticity. Some sitters even complained that their signatures had been copied incorrectly, as did the German philosopher Schelling. David also encountered the problem of the illegibility of the signatures, often making identification of the portraits difficult for their viewers. The significance of David's medallic portraits is expressed by Balzac in the dedication to the sculptor of one of his novels. He writes, "To David, sculptor, the permanence of the work on which I inscribe your name, twice made illustrious in this century," Jacques-Louis David is the other he's referring to, "is very problematic, whereas you have graven my name in bronze, which survives nations, if only in their coins. The day may come when numismatists, discovering amid the ashes of Paris existences perpetuated by you, will wonder at the number of heads crowned in your atelier and endeavor to find in them new dynasties. To you this divine privilege, to me gratitude." Balzac's archaeological vision explicitly links the medallions to the tradition and discourse of numismatics. His language of permanence, survival, and monumentality encompasses not simply the medallions, but the conceptual heart of David's oeuvre. Balzac's mention of dynasties raises the important question of seriality. While the study of coins allowed for the reconstruction of a chronological history of emperors and monarchs, the internal organization of David's medallions is less straightforward. It was not until the late 1820s that the sculptor began to conceive of the works as constituting a series that went beyond the purely private realm of friendship. To order all 500 of them chronologically in terms of production date or alphabetically is not especially illuminating, and to construct groups of medallions by profession, such as artists, writers, scientists, seems a little reductive. Ultimately, a majority of the works reflect David's complex and extended social network, an interconnected and international web of figures encountered at salons, dinners, professional events, and through introductions by friends, family, and acquaintances. The medallions, thus, are the material evidence of David's physical, social, and intellectual movement in the world. In his 1778 treatise on sculpture, Johann Gottfried Herder argued that, I quote, "Colossal figures are not foreign and unnatural to sculpture, but proper to it. They are its origin and essence. A statue does not stand in light, It creates its own light. A statue is not placed in space, it creates its own space. Now, this magical, self-generating quality of gigantic sculpture is central to David's philosophy of art. For him, the colossal affects a kind of transubstantiation, what he calls apotheosis. The colossal statue of a great man presents not his literal, fleshly body, but the infinite idea of him. This was not always understood or appreciated by his contemporaries. In 1836, for example, the sculptor began modeling a colossal portrait of the painter Gérard. According to David, Gérard asked for the proportions to be reduced to those of life. For painting, David responds, it must be like that, since that art has the express mission to render reality. Sculpture, on the other hand, he writes, has no other mission than the apotheosis of the soul. It is the apparition of the thing represented. And here I think David reaches the boundary or endpoint against which sculpture and his ideas butt their head. Because how can a sculpture be the apparition of a thing represented? How can something so subservient to the laws of gravity and of materiality be beyond material and present something intangible and completely universal? But David never really managed to find some kind of way out of that problem, I think, as have most sculptors since then. As Jean-Pierre Vernant has explained, the word colossal from colossus did not initially have any connotation of size. The fundamental characteristic of the colossus, Vernant writes, is that it is fixed to one spot, immobile. David valued this quality of intransigence. I cannot adequately describe, he wrote, the sense of disgust I feel when I see a statue dragged from the artist's studio and which sways on one of those transport carts. I like art to be in the place it should occupy forever, and that one takes the trouble to go and see in person. The immovable statue on its pedestal, or the picture embedded in the mural of a monument. I cannot suffer the effect of a painting in a mobile frame. It gives me the impression of the merchant shop. And you may be wondering why there's a medal on the screen right now as I'm talking about the problem of mobility and intransigence for David. I think some of David's reticence concerning the medallions was due in part to this mobility of the works themselves, but he completely understood that these mobile objects served a magnificent purpose in that they could reach people, not just all over France, but all over the world. They were almost like political pamphlets that could be passed from hand to hand, given as gifts, placed on tables next to one another and shifted around to create new configurations of or personal pantheons of famous people. But the question of commercialism troubled David, and the decades immediately following 1830 witnessed a surge in the commercialization and reproduction of art, especially with the introduction of new technologies such as lithography and photography, and of reduction apparatuses for sculpture. At the very moment of the ascendancy of museums such as the Louvre, these new methods of reproduction provided new and alternative means for an ever-growing public to engage with both historical and contemporary works of art. Public monuments became bibelots, original museum pieces became common parlor accessories, and dense matter was transferred to printed paper. David's relationship to these developments was typically complicated. In the 1830s, he provided works for the French inventor Colas to use when experimenting with his machine for the proportional reduction of sculpture. And another of Colas's machines was deployed to produce mechanically engraved trompe-l'oeil reproductions of his medals, and a reprint of that book can be seen downstairs in the exhibition. It would also appear that he entertained the idea of using the daguerreotype. Now, David was insistent that he would never receive financial benefit for the reproduction of the medals, and this is very true. He would give the model to the founder and request 3 bronze casts, one for him, one for his museum in Angers, and one for the sitter. Then he would give the model to the founder and say, do with it what you will, without signing a contract for reproduction, which was, I think, completely unique in that period, and certainly marks David out from his nemesis, such as Pradier, who were producing buxom young mythological nudes in statuette form for mass reproduction for their own financial benefit. But David's works were, the busts and statuary as much as the medallions, were constantly reproduced. He made plaster casts and sent them to friends and institutions, and had bronze statuettes made after his large-scale monuments. Some, like the Ambroise Paré, were edited in various sizes by commercial foundries such as Barbedian. And I think you can see up the top here, from the page of a catalogue from Barbedian, the availability of certain sizes and prices for a statuette like the one you see here. Much less expensive then, I think, than now. All these works ended up taking on lives of their own, circulating throughout Europe and America. They effectively blurred any neat division between public monuments and private works of art. This was entirely in keeping with David's expansive concept of the public sphere. His Liberty statuette that you will see downstairs was also conceived of as being available readily to the general public, and he hoped to see it one day throughout humble homes in France. Often, David would produce drawings by which lithographs could be made after his medals for even greater proliferation to a wide audience. His highly finished drawing after the political medal, the 4 Sergeants of La Rochelle, for example, was undoubtedly drawn as the model for a lithographic reproduction that appeared in L'Artiste with an accompanying article by Alphonse Esquirot in 1846. A medal, Esquirot writes in his essay, has the advantage of being a monument in circulation and puts an idea in everyone's hands. The lithographic reproduction, I think, only extends this function. It is perhaps with these reproductions, such as the one on the right, that David, perhaps unwittingly, best adapted monumentality to the realities and demands of modern life. For David d'Angers, the preservation and representation of the past was an essential task for modern artists. Living in an age that venerated the idea of exceptional individuals and increasingly feared the vast emptiness of oblivion, he adapted the form and content of sculpted monuments to meet not only the exigencies of his present, but also those of an imagined future. He drew freely and critically upon all the advanced ideas of his time in order to fashion an understanding of monumentality that engaged with literature, science, history, and politics. Today, it is possible to visit David's gallery in Angers and walk amongst a forest of blindingly white plaster statuary, an almost complete installation of his oeuvre. Here, the boundary between artifact and artwork, original and reproduction, is continually porous. Gathered within the converted 13th century abbey is an entire population of famous faces, preserving not merely the traits of moral or intellectual exemplarity, but also the visible and material achievements of a sculptor whose constant innovation produced some of the most memorable and complex images of the Romantic era. Thank you.